Viking expansion is the process by which the Vikings sailed most of the North Atlantic, reaching south to North Africa and east to Russia, Constantinople and the Middle East as looters, traders, colonists and mercenaries. Vikings under Leif Ericsson, the heir to Erik the Red, reached North America and set up a short-lived settlement in present-day Meadows, Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. Longer and more established settlements were formed in Greenland, Iceland, Great Britain and Normandy. Motivation for expansion. There is much debate among historians about what drove the Viking expansion. One widely held idea is that it was a quest for retaliation against continental Europeans for their previous invasions of Viking homelands, such as Charlemagne's campaign to force Scandinavian pagans to convert to Christianity by killing any who refused to become baptized. The historian Rudolf Sumek has observed, "It is not a coincidence if the early Viking activity occurred during the reign of Charlemagne." Quote, "Those who favor this explanation point out that the penetration of Christianity into Scandinavia caused serious conflict and divided Norway for almost a century. However, the first target of Viking raids was not the Frankish kingdom, but England, which seems inconsistent with vengeance as a motive." Another idea is that the Viking population had exceeded the agricultural potential of the homeland. This may have been true of western Norway, where there were few reserves of land, but it is unlikely the rest of Scandinavia was experiencing famine. Alternatively, some scholars propose that the Viking expansion was driven by a youth bulge effect. Since the eldest son of a family customarily inherited the family's entire estate, younger sons had to seek their fortune by emigrating or engaging in raids. However, no rise in population, youth bulge, or decline in agricultural production during this period has been definitively demonstrated, nor is it clear why such pressures would have prompted expansion overseas rather than into the vast, uncultivated forest areas in the interior of the Scandinavian peninsula. Although perhaps emigration or sea raids may have been easier or more profitable than clearing large areas of forest for farm and pasture in a region with a limited growing season. An idea that avoids these shortcomings is that the Scandinavians might have practiced selective procreation leading to a shortage of women, and that the Vikings' main motive for emigration was to acquire wives. Although this would not explain why the Vikings chose to settle in other countries rather than bringing the women back with them to Scandinavia, it is also possible that a decline in the profitability of old trade routes drove the Vikings to seek out new, more profitable ones. Trade between Western Europe and the rest of Eurasia may have suffered after the Roman Empire fell in the 5th century, and the expansion of Islam in the 7th century may have reduced trade opportunities within Western Europe by redirecting resources along the Silk Road. Trade in the Mediterranean was at its lowest level in history when the Vikings began their expansion. The Viking expansion opened new trade routes in Arabic and Frankish lands, and took control of trade markets previously dominated by the Frisians after the Franks destroyed the Frisian fleet. Settlement demographics. Viking settlements in Ireland and Great Britain are thought to have been primarily male enterprises. However, some graves show nearly equal male-female distribution. Disagreement is partly due to method of classification. Previous archaeology often guessed biological sex from burial artifacts, whereas modern archaeology may use osteology to find biological sex, and isotope analysis to find origin. The males buried during that period in a cemetery on the Isle of Man had mainly names of Norse origin, while the females there had names of indigenous origin. Irish and British women are mentioned in old texts on the founding of Iceland, indicating that the Viking explorers were accompanied by women from the British Isles who either came along voluntarily or were taken along by force. Genetic studies of the population in the Western Isles and Isle of Skye also show that Viking settlements were established mainly by male Vikings, who mated with women from the local populations of those places. However, not all Viking settlements were primarily male. Genetic studies of the Shetland population suggest that family units consisting of Viking women as well as men were the norm among the migrants to these areas. This may be because areas like Shetland Island, being closer to Scandinavia, were more suitable targets for family migrations, while frontier settlements further north and west were more suitable for groups of unattached male colonizers. British Isles, England. During the reign of King Beorhtric of Wessex, 3 ships of Northmen landed at Portland Bay in Dorset. The local reeve mistook the Vikings for merchants and directed them to the nearby royal estate, but they killed him and his men. The earliest recorded planned raid, on the 6th of January 793, was on the monastery on the island of Lindisfarne off the east coast of England. According to the 12th century Anglo-Norman chronicler Simeon of Durham, the resident monks were killed, or thrown into the sea to drown, or carried away as slaves, along with some of the church treasures. In 875, after enduring 8 decades of repeated Viking raids, the monks fled Lindisfarne, carrying the relics of St. Cuthbert with them. In 865, a group of hitherto uncoordinated bands of predominantly Danish Vikings joined together to form a large army and landed in East Anglia. The army was described by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as the Great Heathen Army and was said to have been led by Evert the Boneless, Halfdan and Guthrum. They crossed England into Northumbria and captured York, where some settled as farmers. Most of the English kingdoms, being in turmoil, could not stand against the Vikings, but Alfred of Wessex defeated the Great Army at the Battle of Edington in 878. There followed the Treaty of Wedmore the same year and the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum in 886. These treaties formalized the boundaries of the kingdoms and the Viking Danelaw territory, with provisions for peaceful relations between the English and the Vikings. Despite these treaties, conflict continued on and off. However, Alfred and his successors were eventually able to drive back the Viking frontier and retake York. A new wave of Vikings appeared in England in 947, when Erik Bloodaxe captured York. The Viking presence continued through the reign of Cnut the Great, after which a series of inheritance arguments weakened the hold-on power of Cnut's heirs. In one instance in England, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a small Viking fleet attacked a rich monastery at Jarrow. The Vikings were met with stronger resistance than they had expected. Their leaders were killed. The raiders escaped, only to have their ships beached at Tynemouth and the crews killed by locals. This was one of the last raids on England for about 40 years. The Vikings focused instead on Ireland and Scotland. When Edward the Confessor died in 1066, his successor Harold Godwinson was challenged by the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada. Hardrada was killed, and his Norwegian army defeated by Godwinson at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Godwinson himself was killed when the English army were defeated at the Battle of Hastings in October 1066 by William the Conqueror. William was crowned King of England on the 25th of December 1066. However, it was several years before he was able to bring the kingdom under his complete control. The Danish king King Sweyn Estridsson sailed up the Humber in 1070 with an army in support of Edgar the Atheling, the last male member of the English royal family. However, after capturing York, Sweyn accepted a payment from William to desert Edgar. 5 years later, one of Sweyn's sons set sail for England to support another English rebellion, but it had been crushed before they arrived, so they settled for plundering the city of York and surrounding area, before returning home. In 1085, Sweyn's son, now Canute IV of Denmark, planned a major invasion against England, but the assembled fleet never sailed. There was no serious invasion or raids of England by the Danes after this. It is important to bear in mind that not all the Norse arriving in Ireland and Great Britain came as raiders. Many arrived with families and livestock, often in the wake of the capture of territory by the forces. The populations then merged over time by intermarriage into the Anglo-Saxon population of these areas. Many words in the English language are from Old Scandinavian languages, showing the importance of this contact. Scotland. The monastery at Iona on the west coast was first raided in 794, and had to be abandoned some 50 years later after several devastating attacks. While there are few records from the earliest period, it is believed that Scandinavian presence in Scotland increased in the 830s. The isles to the north and west of Scotland were heavily colonized by Norwegian Vikings. Shetland, Orkney and the Hebrides came under Norse control, sometimes as fiefs under the King of Norway, and at other times as separate entities under variously the kings of the Isles, the earldom of Orkney and the later kings of Man and the Isles. Shetland and Orkney were the last of these to be incorporated into Scotland in as late as 1468. Cornwall in 722. According to the Welsh annals, the Cornish gained a victory at the Battle of Heffield. The battle was probably against the neighbouring Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex led by King Ine. The battle may have been in the Camel Estuary area, perhaps near modern-day Padstow. This battle, plus the continual harrying of Wessex by their Danish allies, allowed the Cornish to remain independent for the next 100 years, with their eastern border on the River Exe-River Tour line until 838. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reported that heathen men raided Charmouth, Dorset in 833 AD. Then in 997 AD they destroyed the Dartmoor town of Lidford, and from 1001 AD to 1003 AD they occupied the old Roman city of Exeter. The Cornish were subjugated by Aethelstan and the border finally set at the River Tamar in 936. However, the Cornish remained semi-autonomous until their annexation into England after the Norman conquest. Wales was not colonized by the Vikings significantly as in eastern England. The Vikings did, however, settle in small numbers in the south around St. David's, Haverfordwest, and the Gower. Place names such as Stockholm, Skoma, and Swansea remain as evidence of the Norse settlement. The Vikings, however, were not able to set up a Viking state to control Wales, owing to the powerful forces of Welsh kings, and unlike in Scotland, the aristocracy was relatively unharmed. Nevertheless, following the successful Viking alliance with Britannia in 865, the Britons made the peace with the Danes, and a Viking-Welsh alliance in 878 defeated an Anglo-Saxon army from Mercia. Although the Welsh had been long-time enemies of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia, the relationship with the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex was somewhat warmer. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle of 893, for example, refers to Vikings being pursued by a combined force of West Saxons and North Welsh along the River Severn. The combined Anglo-Saxon and Welsh army eventually overtook the Vikings before defeating them at the Battle of Buttington. The city of Swansea was founded by the imperialist Sweyn Forkbeard, king of Denmark, who by 1013 was king of the Danes, Anglo-Saxons and Norwegians. Swansea is a corruption of the Norse Swansea, which means Swain's Island. The island refers to the area around the estuary of the River Towy. The neighbouring Gower Peninsula has some place names of Norse origin. 20 miles west of Cardiff on the Vale of Glamorgan coast is the semi-flooded island of Tusk, a rock, which takes its name from Tuska, the Viking who established a settlement in the area. Ireland. The Vikings conducted extensive raids in Ireland and founded many towns, including Dublin, Limerick, Mullingar, Wexford, Waterford and Lechlap. Literature, crafts, and decorative styles in Ireland and Britain reflected Scandinavian culture. Vikings traded at Irish markets in Dublin. Excavations found imported fabrics from England, Byzantium, Persia, and Central Asia. Dublin became so crowded by the 11th century that houses were constructed outside the town walls. The Vikings pillaged monasteries on Ireland's west coast in 795, and then spread out to cover the rest of the coastline. The north and east of the island were most affected. During the first 40 years, the raids were conducted by small, mobile Viking groups. From 830 on, the groups consisted of large fleets of Viking ships. From 840, the Vikings began establishing permanent bases at the coasts. Dublin was the most significant settlement in the long term. The Irish became accustomed to the Viking presence and culture. In some cases they became allies and also intermarried throughout all of Ireland. In 832, a Viking fleet of about 120 ships under Turgesius invaded kingdoms on Ireland's northern and eastern coasts. Some believe that the increased number of invaders coincided with Scandinavian leaders' desires to control the profitable raids on the western shores of Ireland. During the mid-830s, raids began to push deeper into Ireland. Navigable waterways made this deeper penetration possible. After 840, the Vikings had several bases in strategic locations throughout Ireland. In 838, a small Viking fleet entered the River Liffey in eastern Ireland, probably led by the chieftain Saxolb, who was killed later that year. The Vikings set up a base, which the Irish called Longforts. This Longfort would eventually become Dublin. After this interaction, the Irish experienced Viking forces for about 40 years. The Vikings also established Longforts in Cork, Limerick, Waterford, and Wexford. The Vikings were driven out of Ireland for a short period around 900, but returned to Waterford in 914 to found what would become Ireland's first city. The other Longforts were soon reoccupied and developed into cities and towns. The last major Irish battle involving Vikings was the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, in which a large force from the pan-Viking world and their Irish allies opposed Brian Boru, then the High King of Ireland, and his forces, a small contingent of which were Viking defectors. The battle was fought in what is the now Dublin suburb of Clontarf on Good Friday of that year. Boru, the Irish High King, had allowed the Viking King of Dublin, Sigtryg Silkbeard, 1 year to prepare for his coming assault. Silkbeard responded by offering the bed of his mother to several Viking lords from Scandinavia, Ireland and Britain. The savage melee between the heavily mailed Norse and the unarmoured, yet undaunted Gaels ended in a rout of the Vikings and their Irish allies. Careful accounts were taken by both sides during the battle, and thus many famous warriors sought each other out for personal combat and glory. High King Brian, who was nearly 80, He did not personally engage in the battle but retired to his tent, where he spent the day in quiet prayer. The Viking Brodier of Man chanced upon Brian's tent as he fled the field. He and a few followers seized the opportunity, and surprised the High King, killing the aged Brian before being captured. Brian's foster son Wulf the Quarrelsome later tracked down and dispatched Brodier by disembowelment. Wulf, watching as Brodier marched and wound his own innards around the trunk of a large tree. The battle was fairly matched for most of the day, and each side had great respect for the prowess of the other. However, in the end, the Irish forced the Norse to return to the sea. Many of the fleeing Vikings were drowned in the surf due to the heavy mailcoats as they struggled for the safety of the long ships. Others were pursued and slain further inland. After the battle, Viking power was broken in Ireland forever, though many settled Norse remained in the cities and prospered greatly with the Irish through trade. With Brian dead, Ireland returned to the fractured kingdom it had once been, but was now cleared of further Viking predation.